April 30th, 1972, 0430 hours, Cua Viet River, Quang Tri Province. The night burned with its own light. The river shimmered like black oil under the flare of distant explosions, and the eastern horizon pulsed orange as South Vietnamese defences disintegrated mile by mile. The bridge, the last bridge, stood like a dying artery across the Cua Viet, its concrete span trembling with the stampede of retreating men, trucks and armour. South of it, the jungle hissed with the sound of panic, engines choking, boots splashing, shouted orders drowned beneath artillery. For weeks, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam had fought to hold the line against the North's massive spring offensive, the Easter offensive. Now the line no longer existed. Quang Tri was falling. The map itself seemed to crumble, erased by the red tide of tanks and infantry pouring from the north. By dawn, the Cua Viet would become the last thread of escape between survival and annihilation. The bridge was already choking under the weight of the retreat. Jeeps loaded with wounded soldiers rattled across, their drivers silent and hollow-eyed. Refugees stumbled through the mud, carrying children, chickens, anything not already lost. The air stank of diesel, cordite and blood. Above it all, the flat roar of enemy guns never ceased, steady, mechanical, merciless. At 0445 hours, the first enemy shells found the riverbank. They struck the water like hammers, sending geysers of flame and spray into the dark. Shrapnel tore through the crowd, trucks jackknifed, blocking lanes. Soldiers shoved civilians aside, desperate to clear the path. Panic became a living thing, clawing at the bridge with thousands of hands. Somewhere on the far bank, officers screamed for order, but their words drowned in the noise of retreat. Beneath the bridge, the current carried away broken rifles and floating bodies. The Cua Viet had become both road and grave. Those who reached the southern side looked back only once, toward the collapsing province they were leaving behind, a blur of fire and shadows, before vanishing into the southern jungle. Then came the sound that froze every man within earshot, the grinding rumble of engines that were not their own. Tanks. The ground trembled as North Vietnamese T-54s emerged through the smoke, their turrets glinting faintly in the flare light. Behind them marched the infantry, disciplined, steady, advancing through the wreckage like a tide that could not be stopped. The enemy had reached the northern bank. Artillery shifted its aim. Shells began to walk their way down the river, closer and closer to the bridge. One hit struck the centre span, tearing open the concrete deck. Screams erupted. The column faltered, unsure whether to run forward or back. For a heartbeat, the entire retreat hung in suspension, thousands of lives balancing on the decision of a single minute. In the chaos, a small group of soldiers broke off toward the western embankment. They carried what weapons remained functional: machine guns, launchers, spare belts of ammunition. They knew someone would have to stay behind if the rest were to cross alive. It wasn't bravery anymore. It was arithmetic. Someone had to hold the line. The bridge thundered again under another impact. Metal twisted. Flames climbed higher. By 0500, the enemy armour was within sight of the northern approach. Flares turned the river white as day, revealing the entire scale of collapse. The broken vehicles, the drowned men, the terrified eyes of those still running. The sound of machine guns cracked through the morning mist, sporadic and thin, like a last heartbeat. And amid that roar, amid the confusion and ruin, the story that would outlive the bridge itself began. Not in orders or strategy, but in a single act of defiance. One soldier, unknown among thousands, would soon take position behind a sandbagged gun, staring down the iron tide rolling toward him. The fate of the retreat would rest not in battalions or airstrikes, but in the hands of a man whose name history almost forgot. The Cua Viet River swallowed the last light of night as the first tracer rounds lit the dawn. The retreat had begun hours earlier. Now the real battle, the one that would decide who lived to cross that bridge, was about to begin. March 1972, 2 months before the fall. In the lowlands of Quang Tri, where the fields met the salt wind from the sea, Nguyen Ngoc Nhuan lived the quiet rhythm of a soldier's in-between days. He was 31 years old, lean from years of war, with a face carved by sun and smoke. There were no medals on his uniform, no stories written about him in Saigon papers. His name never appeared on command rosters beyond the company level. Yet among his comrades, Nguyen was known for something far rarer than rank. He was reliable. When orders broke down, when officers disappeared, he stayed. He came from the rice paddies of Thua Thien Province, the son of a fisherman who had never seen the inside of a school. His life before the army had been measured in tides and nets, not maps or politics. He had joined the ARVN in 1963, not from ideology but necessity, a way to earn rice and send a few piastres home. Through years of fighting, he had learnt the rhythms of survival: dig deep, fire short bursts, move before the artillery finds you. He had fought in Hue, Khe Sanh, and countless nameless villages burned and rebuilt in the endless turning of the war. In the spring of 1972, he was assigned to a security detail near the Cua Viet supply depot, a quiet assignment that gave him little reason to think about glory or death. The river ran wide and calm then, and the soldiers who guarded it spent their nights smoking, playing cards, and listening to the distant hum of gunships far inland. It was the lull before the storm that no one believed would come. Then came April, and with it, the thunder. When the Easter offensive began, the northern sky changed overnight. Reports filtered in of entire divisions pouring across the DMZ, of tanks moving through jungle paths once thought impassable. Artillery fire began to rain down on Quang Tri City, and the air itself seemed to carry the vibration of disaster. Units collapsed, communications vanished. Helicopters crowded the skies, hauling the wounded south. Nguyen's unit received orders to prepare fallback positions along the Cua Viet River. They dug trenches, set up machine gun nests, and waited. Rumours spread faster than orders, that the Northern Front was gone, that the 3rd Division had been shattered, that even American advisors were pulling back. The faces around Nguyen grew pale and silent. The smell of panic hung heavier than gunpowder. Through it all, he worked methodically, cleaning his M60, counting belts of ammunition, building cover from sandbags and splintered timber. He did not talk about victory or defeat. He had long stopped thinking in those terms. There was only the next task, the next order to follow, the next position to hold. When he looked across the river, he could see the southern bank lined with trucks and boats, the retreat route. He knew, without being told, that if the enemy reached the bridge, chaos would turn into slaughter. Someone would have to buy time. Someone would have to stay. His commander, a man named Major Lay, told the men that reinforcements would arrive within a day. They never did. The enemy came instead, tanks grinding forward through the smoke, infantry crawling along the river like ants. In the confusion, the command post dissolved. Radios went silent, orders stopped. The bridge, once just another checkpoint, became the last road out. By then, Nguyen Ngoc Nhuan had already made his choice. Whether it was volunteered or assigned, no one could later say. But those who survived remembered seeing him drag the M60 to the bridge's edge, stacking ammunition boxes around him like walls. They remembered how calm he looked, even as the sky cracked open with incoming fire. He was not a hero by design. He had no speech to give, no cause beyond the man beside him. Yet in that moment, on that river, history turned its gaze, however briefly, toward a soldier it would soon forget. As the first shells struck the northern shore, Nguyen chambered around and checked the belt feed. The bridge behind him groaned under the weight of retreating men. Ahead, the night burned red. The forgotten soldier was about to step into the heart of the storm, alone. April 27th, 1972, 1600 hours, Quang Tri City. The sky had turned the colour of ash. Smoke hung over the city like a storm that would never pass. For days, the thunder of artillery had rolled from the north, shaking the ground, rattling window frames, and filling the air with the thick metallic scent of destruction. The Easter offensive had arrived in full, and Quang Tri, the northern shield of South Vietnam, was dying by the hour. From the citadel walls, the defenders could see the horizon pulsing with flame. North Vietnamese armour was pushing through the countryside, rolling over outposts that had held for years. Columns of refugees clogged every road leading south. Families pushed bicycles loaded with their lives, bedding, rice sacks, chickens tied by the legs, their faces caked with dust and fear. Overhead, the roar of jets and the crack of anti-air fire made the sky a battlefield of its own. By late afternoon, the 3rd ARVN Division was splintering. What had begun as an organised withdrawal became a stampede. Orders were shouted and lost in the noise. Commanders vanished. Units folded into one another like waves breaking against rock. And still the shells came. 130mm guns hammering the city in precise, merciless rhythm. Buildings crumbled. Streets vanished under debris. The wounded screamed in alleyways that no longer had names. Nguyen Ngoc Nhuan's unit had been positioned east of the city when the line broke. They were supposed to cover the retreat toward the Cua Viet River, holding open the route long enough for convoys to pass. But every hour the enemy closed the distance. The tanks moved like beasts through smoke, their turrets turning with mechanical patience, firing again and again into the collapsing streets. Each impact seemed to erase another piece of the map. At 1700 hours the northern gate fell. The defenders, those still alive, began to stream toward the south, their uniforms black with soot, their weapons half empty. Helicopters swooped low to lift out command staff and wounded, blades scattering dust over the chaos below. For those left on the ground, the airlift might as well have been the moon. Nhuan and his men reached the outskirts of Quang Tri as the last defensive perimeter crumbled. Behind them, the city burned, columns of fire rising from fuel depots, ammunition dumps, and homes struck by indirect fire. Ahead lay the narrow ribbon of road that led to the Cua Viet Bridge. Trucks and APCS jammed it end to end, their engines choking in the crush of retreat. Soldiers abandoned vehicles and fled on foot, desperate to get clear before the next barrage found them. The order came through faintly, almost lost in static. All units fall back to the river, hold at all costs. It was the last coherent transmission many of them would ever hear. The march south became a nightmare of exhaustion and noise. Shells fell on both sides of the road, sending showers of dirt and flame into the retreating column. The wounded were left where they fell. Civilians clung to the sides of trucks, screaming for space that didn't exist. At night, the horizon burned so bright that shadows flickered across the faces of the living and the dead alike. By the morning of April 28th, the Cua Viet River was in sight, a wide, glimmering ribbon beneath a haze of smoke. Across it lay the last defensive line before the coast, and beyond that, the safety of Hue. For the soldiers still standing, the bridge represented survival, a final thread holding them to the idea of escape. But as the remnants of the ARVN crossed onto the southern bank, the reports grew worse. The North Vietnamese had breached every northern perimeter. Tanks were already approaching the river from multiple directions. The bridge, their lifeline, would soon be the next target. For Nguyen Ngoc Nhuan, it was the moment when the war stopped being a line on a map and became something smaller, sharper, and unbearably clear. The city was gone. The retreat was collapsing. And somewhere, amid the roar of engines and the smell of burning oil, a decision waited. One that would define everything that followed. The fall of Quang Tri was not marked by surrender, but by silence. The kind that follows when there is nothing left to hold. April 29th, 1972. 0610 hours. Northern bank of the Cua Viet River. The fog clung low to the water, grey and heavy with the stink of diesel and cordite. Through it came the sound of chaos. Truck engines shouted orders and the occasional rattle of gunfire from somewhere upriver. The retreat had poured across the bridge through the night, a tide of men and machines that seemed endless, until by dawn only fragments of units remained on the northern shore. Nguyen Ngoc Nhuan stood among them, mud up to his knees, the M60 machine gun slung across his chest. Around him, the remnants of his company were gathering what they could, belts of ammunition, sandbags, broken rifles scavenged from the dead. The air tasted of metal and river salt. Every few seconds another explosion echoed from the tree line, each one closer than the last. The radio sputtered. A voice cut through the static, strained, half-shouted over artillery. "Hold the bridge!" No matter what, hold it until the last truck crosses. It was not a request. It was the kind of order given when command already knew what it meant. The men glanced at one another, faces pale and sleepless. Some argued to pull back, others to dig in. But Nhuan said nothing. He began stacking sandbags by the bridge abutment, setting up his firing position where the road narrowed between the embankments. His hands moved automatically, the muscle memory of a decade in combat. Every movement had purpose. Sight lines, cover, distance. He knew what was coming. By 0700 hours, the fog began to lift. On the far side of the river, the land shimmered with heat and smoke. Columns of black rose from the ruins of the northern approach. Destroyed vehicles, burned out positions, the skeletons of what had once been the ARVN's forward defence. From that haze, the first enemy shapes appeared, tanks moving in slow, deliberate rhythm, their treads grinding through the mud. Infantry followed behind, dark lines stretching toward the river like veins of iron. Someone behind Nguyen whispered a prayer. Others ran. By 0730, most of the surviving troops had retreated across the bridge, leaving behind a skeleton crew to hold the north bank. But the command post was gone, the radio silent again. Orders no longer mattered. There was only the task. Nguyen checked his ammunition. 3 full belts, 2 spares. Enough for minutes, not hours. He set the M60 on its bipod, adjusted the sight, and waited. The air vibrated with the distant growl of approaching armour. Behind him, the bridge trembled under the weight of trucks and soldiers streaming south. They looked back as they crossed, at the figure crouched at the bridgehead, smoke curling around him, then turned away, unwilling to see what holding the line would cost. The first shells struck at 0755 hours. One exploded near the western embankment, showering dirt and debris across the river. Another hit the roadway, collapsing part of the guardrail into the current. Nguyen didn't move. He watched the approach through the haze, finger resting lightly on the trigger. When the order came to hold, no one had said how long. At 0810, a burst of machine gun fire from the far side marked the beginning. Bullets cracked through the morning air, slapping against concrete and sandbags. Nguyen waited until he saw movement, dark figures emerging behind the wreckage of a half-burned truck. Then he opened fire. The M60 roared to life, its barrel flashing in the morning light. The first belt rattled through, brass casings spilling across the mud. The advancing infantry dropped where they stood. Smoke thickened. The bridge became a wall of sound. Gunfire, explosions, the roar of engines. Behind him, the last convoy cleared the southern bank. The final trucks lurched forward, carrying the wounded and what remained of the division's supplies. The bridge still stood, but barely. By 0830, Nguyen's world had narrowed to a strip of concrete, a machine gun, and the endless noise of war. Every round he fired bought seconds. Every second meant another life across the river. The retreat had become survival, and survival now depended on one man who refused to move. April 29th, 1972, 0845 hours. Northern approach to the Cua Viet Bridge. The mist had burned away. What remained was heat, raw, blinding, suffocating. The sun climbed over the river and found a battlefield stripped of colour, only smoke and steel and blood. Nguyen Ngoc Nhuan lay prone behind the sandbag wall, sweat running into his eyes, the M60's barrel glowing faintly red. He had been firing for nearly 20 minutes, long enough for the mud around him to churn into black water, long enough for the enemy to understand that one man still held the bridge. The first wave came with precision. Infantry in dark uniforms moved low and fast, leapfrogging between the wrecks of burned-out trucks. Behind them, the steady thud of tank treads shook the ground. The sound wasn't just noise. It was pressure, vibration, a rhythm that rattled through his bones. The tanks advanced in line, their turrets scanning, snouts of iron searching for the single gun that defied them. Nguyen fed a fresh belt into the receiver, locked it, and pressed his cheek to the stock. The river wind carried the smell of oil and cordite. He aimed low, always low, to cut the legs out from the advancing troops. The first burst tore through the morning air, bright traces stitching across the open ground. Men fell. Others dropped flat, pressed into the mud. The gunfire became continuous, each round lighting the smoke like fireflies in a storm. The enemy regrouped quickly. Mortar rounds began to drop around the bridgehead, each impact throwing shards of earth and shrapnel into the air. The concussion hammered through his chest. One shell landed close enough to knock the M60 from its mount. His ears rang. He tasted blood. But when the ringing faded, the sound that replaced it was worse, the grinding of tracks as the tanks moved forward again. Nguyen shifted position, dragging the gun behind a slab of broken concrete. He could see the first tank clearly now, a T-54, its hull streaked with mud, its turret swinging toward him. He fired at the infantry first, forcing them to scatter. The tank's cannon thundered, the shells slamming into the bridge approached 10 metres away. Concrete rained down. Smoke filled his lungs. He didn't stop. He couldn't. He adjusted, fired again, short bursts to conserve ammunition. The barrels smoked. Spent casings hissed where they landed in the puddles. The world narrowed to the sight picture, the rhythm of the trigger, the the smell of burning oil. The M60 stuttered, overheated, jammed. He slammed the cover open, yanked the belt free, cleared it, slammed it shut again. Every second counted. The second tank hesitated, blocked by wreckage. He saw an opportunity, one chance. An abandoned jeep lay overturned near the bridge entrance, its fuel tank leaking steadily into the mud. Nguyen fired into it. The explosion bloomed white and orange, the blast wave flattening men and debris alike. The shock forced the leading tank to halt. For a few moments, the entire assault stalled under a curtain of smoke and fire. He reloaded. His hands shook, not from fear, but from exhaustion. The heat from the gun had blistered his palms. His throat was raw. Every breath tasted of dust and metal. He could barely hear anything over the roar of his own weapon, but through the haze he could still see movement. Soldiers crawling, regrouping, preparing another push. Minutes dragged like hours. Each time they rose, he cut them down. Each time they retreated, he adjusted his position, always staying low, never staying still. He felt the bridge tremble behind him. The last vehicles crossing, the rumble of engines fading into the southern jungle. The first wave broke. What was left of it withdrew into the smoke, leaving bodies scattered across the northern approach. The tanks fell silent, turrets motionless, as if stunned by the defiance of a single gun. For the first time in hours, Nguyen paused. He could hear the river again, slow, steady, indifferent. He checked the belts, half empty. The barrel glowed dull red. He knew the next attack would come soon, heavier, closer, more determined. But for now, the bridge still stood. He wiped the sweat from his eyes and looked toward the far shore. The retreating column had vanished into the distance. No reinforcements were coming. The burden was his alone. The first wave had failed. The next would not. April 29th, 1972, 09:20 hours. Cua Viet Bridge, North Approach. The smoke had thickened into a wall. The air shimmered with heat, dust, and the metallic tang of spent ammunition. Nguyen Ngoc Nhuan crouched behind the shattered remains of a truck, feeding another belt into the M60. His shoulders ached, his hands blistered from the heat of the barrel. The gun was an extension of himself now, heavy, burning, alive. From beyond the smoke came the rumble again, deeper this time, steady, methodical. Tanks, more than before. Their engines sounded like thunder rolling across iron plains. The ground trembled under their weight. Each vibration ran through the bridge, shaking dust loose from its concrete seams. The North Vietnamese were regrouping. The infantry that had fallen back now moved in disciplined lines, supported by armour that crawled forward like steel beasts. The lead tank pushed through the burning wreck of the jeep, its hull slick with soot and flame. Behind it, two more followed, turrets turning, guns trained on the bridge's lone defender. Nguyen exhaled slowly, the way he had learned in training years ago. Fire only when you can see. Fire when it counts. The M60 bucked against his shoulder. The tracers arced low across the smoke, striking the ground at the feet of the advancing infantry. They scattered, some falling, others diving for cover. The tanks didn't slow. The lead vehicle's cannon roared, the shells slamming into the embankment beside him. The blast threw him backward, dirt and shrapnel raining down. His ears rang, his vision flickered white. He rolled, pulled himself up and dragged the M60 to a new position behind a concrete girder. His lungs burned. His hands bled. But he could still see. He could still fight. He waited for the next tank to crest the rise, the smoke curling off its armour like fog over a grave. He opened fire again, short bursts this time, aiming for the vision slits, the tracks, any weak point he could find. Sparks flew where the rounds struck steel. The tank shuddered, slowed, then stopped. He saw the crew hatch open, a figure half rising. He shifted aim and fired once more. The figure vanished. The next two tanks halted, their guns swinging toward him. He dropped low just as the first shell screamed past, slamming into the far side of the bridge. The impact cracked the concrete, sending chips and dust into the air. The bridge moaned, a deep, unnatural sound, as if the structure itself could feel the strain. Nguyen crawled along the edge of the span, using the wreckage as cover. The M60's barrel smoked, each shot slower, heavier. He had one more spare barrel left. He swapped it under fire, fingers fumbling with the locking pin as bullets slapped into the sandbags around him. The heat burned through his gloves. Still, he finished, slammed the cover shut and fired again. This time his round struck luck, or destiny. The lead tank's fuel line caught fire. Flames raced along its side, and a moment later it erupted in a violent burst that shook the bridge like an earthquake. The shockwave knocked him flat. When he rose, his ears were ringing and his mouth filled with grit. But he saw it, the tank burning bright against the grey morning, black smoke twisting skyward like a banner of defiance. The explosion forced the others to fall back. For the first time since dawn, the battlefield went still. No shouting, no shells. Only the hiss of the fire and the moan of the wind over the river. He changed position again, crawling behind a toppled beam, scanning the northern approach through the drifting haze. The enemy was regrouping. He could see silhouettes moving, officers shouting orders, pointing toward the bridge. They would come again. They always did. Nguyen's uniform was torn, his body trembling from exhaustion. He could feel every heartbeat pounding against his ribs. Yet he stayed crouched, eyes fixed on the smoke ahead. The bridge behind him still thrummed with life, the faint echo of footsteps, the last of the wounded making it across. Every second he held the line was a second bought for them. The iron tide would come again, stronger, closer, unstoppable. But for now, in the brief silence between assaults, Nguyen Ngoc Nhuan remained alone on the northern bank. One man against the weight of an army, one heartbeat against the thunder of steel. April 29th, 1972, 09:55 hours. The north end of the Cua Viet Bridge. The sun was high now, burning through the smoke like a merciless eye. The bridge was no longer grey, it was blackened and cratered, twisted by fire. The air shimmered with heat rising from the wreckage. Nguyen Ngoc Nhuan crouched low behind a mangled support beam, his uniform soaked with sweat and grime, his hands shaking from fatigue. His ears no longer heard explosions as sound but as pressure, dull concussions that thudded through his ribs and skull. The assault never stopped. It came in waves, each one heavier, closer, louder. Mortars rained down in slow, deliberate rhythm. The river ran thick with oil and blood, and the mud beneath him pulsed with every detonation. He had been fighting for almost 3 hours. The M60 was so hot he could smell the metal itself. His fingers were raw from feeding belts, his throat shredded by the smoke he breathed. The enemy had learned. They no longer charged in straight lines. They crawled now, used the wreckage for cover, crept closer every minute. Each time they rose, he fired. Short, precise bursts, conserving what little ammunition he had left. The traces tore through the smoke, each one marking the thin line between him and the horde pressing forward. The tanks returned, slower this time, using the infantry as shields. The ground quivered beneath their treads. One rolled so close he could feel its engine vibrate through the earth. He fired at the lead, not to destroy but to blind, hammering the viewports until sparks and dust filled its slit windows. The tank halted, swung its turret and fired point blank. The shell slammed into the deck behind him, throwing concrete shards into the air like knives. He hit the ground hard, felt something warm spread across his arm. Shrapnel. He tore a strip from his shirt, tied it tight, kept firing. There was no time to think, no room for fear. Only motion. Only the rhythm of loading, aiming, firing, ducking. The world narrowed to the space between his heartbeat and the next bullet. By 10:20 hours, the bridge behind him shook again, but this time not from shell fire. It was collapsing under its own weight. The central span sagged, cracked, and groaned like an old ship breaking apart. He turned once to look. The southern side was filled with smoke and movement, men running, shouting, trucks reversing, engineers screaming to blow the far supports. But they couldn't yet. Too many were still crossing. Too many still needed time. Time was the only thing he could give them. He fired again, each burst shorter, tighter. The M60 bucked hard, nearly tearing from his grip. The belt ran dry. He reached for another, hands slipping in the mud. Only 2 belts remained. He knew what that meant. He reloaded anyway. The next shell landed close, too close. The blast ripped away his cover, sent him sprawling into the open. Dirt filled his mouth. The world tilted sideways, blurred, then steadied again. He was still alive. The machine gun lay half buried beside him. He dragged it up, planted the bipod into the dirt, and kept firing. Smoke cloaked everything now. The tanks, the soldiers, even the sky. He could see only flashes of movement, silhouettes darting through the haze. Each time he pressed the trigger, it was instinct, not thought. His hands moved on their own, the way a man breathes underwater, desperate, automatic, unthinking. At 1100 hours, his barrel seized. He swapped it again, slower this time. The metal burned through his gloves, searing his palms. He gritted his teeth, slammed the new barrel in place, and fired a burst to test it. The weapon coughed, then steadied. He smiled faintly, a flicker of pride amid ruin. Every minute now was borrowed. His ammunition nearly gone, his body bleeding, his lungs raw. But still he held the line. On the far bank the last convoy reached safety. The retreat, the hundreds who had fled through the night, had made it across because he had stayed. He could not see them, could not know. But the bridge still stood, and as long as it did, he would not move. The hours stretched, endless and burning. 3 hours of hell, carved into a single act of defiance. April 29th, 1972, 11:27 hours. North side of the Cua Viet Bridge. The bridge no longer looked like a bridge. It was a skeleton of concrete and rebar, its spine cracked, its deck gouged open in half a dozen places. Smoke drifted low across the river, rolling over the water like the breath of something ancient and dying. The air stank of cordite, oil and scorched flesh. The gunfire had slowed to scattered bursts, thin and uneven, the rhythm of a battle reaching its end. Nguyen Ngoc Nhuan lay behind the burned-out frame of an armoured truck, his world reduced to mud, steel and the M60. His left arm was bandaged with his own torn sleeve, the fabric soaked dark. His helmet was gone. His face was streaked with dust and dried blood. Every sound, every explosion, every scream reached him through the dull hum of exhaustion. He had been fighting alone for nearly 4 hours. The last belt of ammunition sat across his lap, 2/3 spent. He fed it into the gun with trembling fingers, locked it in, and pressed the charging handle forward. The weapon responded with a solid, familiar click. The sound was strangely comforting, the heartbeat of duty. From the haze ahead, the enemy moved again, not in waves this time, but in a tightening circle, cautious, deliberate, methodical. They knew now it was one man, they were closing in to finish it. The tanks hung back, their barrels aimed at the bridge, waiting for the final order to fire. Infantry crawled closer through the wreckage, spreading out to encircle his position. Nguyen adjusted his sightline, slow and steady. The bridge trembled behind him. Somewhere across the river, engineers were shouting. He knew what came next. The charges were being set. The bridge would be blown the moment he fell silent. He checked the belt again, half gone. He fired short bursts into the mist, each one punctuated by the heavy chug of the M60 and the hiss of ejected casings. Figures dropped. Others froze, uncertain. The tracer rounds carved the smoke into ribbons of light. Each flash cut deeper into the silence, echoing off the riverbanks. A mortar struck close, too close. The blast lifted him off the ground, slammed him hard against the concrete. His vision swam. When it cleared, his hearing was gone, replaced by a high, thin ringing. He looked down. The gun was still in place. His body wasn't whole, but it still moved. That was enough. He dragged himself upright, propped the weapon on the broken beam, and fired again. His rounds chewed into the mud, the air, the darkness itself. He couldn't tell if he was hitting anything anymore. It didn't matter. Every second the gun spoke was another heartbeat for those on the far side of the river. The enemy hesitated, then surged, a last, desperate rush. Dozens of silhouettes rose out of the smoke, shouting, firing, closing the distance. Nguyen emptied the belt into them, the M60 roaring until it went silent with a hollow click. Empty. He reached for another belt. There was none. He sat still for a moment, the world narrowing around him. The wind off the river felt cold now. The heat was gone. He could hear distant shouts, the clatter of boots drawing closer. The tanks were advancing again, their shadows stretching long across the broken road. He pulled his sidearm, fired until it clicked dry. Then he set it down beside the gun, straightened his back and looked toward the southern bank. He couldn't see faces, only smoke, light, and the faint movement of men still crossing, still running, still alive. A shell struck the bridge at mid-span. The shockwave tore through the air. For a heartbeat, everything froze. The tanks, the infantry, the river itself. Then the bridge erupted in a roar of flame and dust. When the smoke cleared, the northern span was gone. The bridge had fallen, severing the enemy's path. Nguyen Ngoc Nhuan did not rise again, but across the river, hundreds of men looked back and saw the smoke curling upward, the echo of one gun fading into silence. They knew what it meant. The bridge had held. They had lived because one man had stayed. The last stand at Cua Viet ended not with surrender, but with the defiance of a single heartbeat, steady until the very end. April 30th, 1972. Dawn. South bank of the Cua Viet River. The sun rose pale and slow over the wreckage. The bridge was gone, its northern half swallowed by the river, the southern span jutting out like the rib of a dead giant. Smoke still rose in thin, ghostly plumes from the far shore. The air smelled of mud, burnt oil, and decay, the breath of a battlefield after everything that could burn had burned. On the southern bank, what remained of the ERVN 3rd Division gathered in silence. Men sat in the mud beside shattered trucks, staring across the water. Some were bandaged, some too weak to stand. None spoke. The roar that had filled their ears for the past day, the artillery, the engines, the machine gun that had refused to stop, was gone now. Only the wind moved across the river. A few soldiers, too restless to sit, searched for survivors among the wreckage. They found bodies tangled in the reeds, uniforms scorched beyond colour. The current carried others away, turning slowly in eddies of brown water. On the far bank, nothing stirred but the smoke. The enemy had pulled back, their assault broken by the destruction of the bridge. The river had become the border again, not of territory, but of survival. Someone asked if the man who stayed behind had made it out. No one answered. They remembered him, the gunner who had covered the retreat. Some had seen him only in flashes through the haze, a lone figure crouched behind the gun, firing until the light itself seemed to bend around him. Others had crossed too late, catching glimpses of traces arcing from the north bank long after the order to withdraw. Every man who escaped owed something to that gun, though few knew the name of the man behind it. By midday the officers began taking stock. The division was scattered, its strength shattered. Command posts were gone, radios dead, maps meaningless. Yet in the middle of that ruin, stories began to spread. One soldier swore he had seen the gunner still firing even after the tanks reached the bridgehead. Another said the explosions that destroyed the span came only after the last rounds left his barrel. Some claimed the gunner had crawled to the detonator himself, setting off the charges when the enemy was too close to stop. No one could prove it. No one could deny it. By evening, as the wounded were loaded onto trucks bound for Hue, the name began to circulate quietly. Nguyen Ngoc Nhuan. It passed from mouth to mouth like something sacred, spoken softly so the wind wouldn't take it. There were no medals waiting for him, no officers writing reports, no photographers to record what he had done. Only the men who had lived because of him, men who would remember that one voice of gunfire across the river when everything else had fallen silent. That night, the survivors made camp a few kilometres south, along the coastal road. The sky was black with smoke, but the stars burned through it, hard and cold. Some prayed. Others stared into the dark, replaying the day in their heads. In the distance, artillery flared again, far away now, beyond the reach of their rifles. The war moved south, relentless as the tide. But in that narrow slice of calm between battles, they felt the weight of what had been lost, and what one man had bought for them. The bridge, the river, the hours of hell that one machine gun had held, all of it became a story told in murmurs beside flickering fires. When dawn came again, the column moved on, leaving behind only wreckage and water. The Cua Viet flowed on, silent witness to what had happened there. And though the records would one day forget his name, the men who crossed that bridge did not. In their memories, Nguyen Ngoc Nhuan remained, the man who stayed when everyone else was running, the one who turned a river of retreat into a wall of defiance. May 1972, weeks after the fall of Quang Tri, the war rolled south like a storm without end. The newspapers in Saigon printed new headlines every morning, counterattacks, losses, retreats, but none spoke of the Cua Viet River. The reports listed bridges destroyed, supply routes cut, but not the name of the man who had died holding one of them. His story drifted instead through whispers, carried by soldiers, passed over campfires, told in the quiet moments between shellings when men needed to believe courage still existed. Nguyen Ngoc Nhuan became a ghost that walked among the living, not in legend, not in ceremony, but in memory, raw, personal, unfinished. The men who had crossed that bridge during the retreat told it differently every time. Some said he fought until his last bullet. Others said he was still alive when the charges blew. But they all said the same thing in the end. He stayed so we could live. In the weeks that followed, the Cua Viet front stabilised for a time. The river became a line on a new map, another temporary boundary drawn in mud and blood. Engineers built a new crossing downstream. Trucks rolled again, convoys moved south, and the war continued as if the river had never been red. Yet the men who had seen that bridge fall could not forget. They spoke of Nhuan as if he were still there, crouched behind his gun, smoke rising around him. To them, he was not a symbol. He was something harder to define. Proof that duty could survive chaos, that one man's choice could buy life for hundreds. In a war that had swallowed entire battalions without a trace, that meant something. Back in Thua Thien Province, his family never received a citation or medal. No officer came with papers or promises. A single letter arrived instead, written by a fellow soldier who had made it across the river. It said only that Nguyen had fought bravely and did not retreat. His wife folded the paper and placed it in a small wooden box beside his photograph, a faded picture of a young man in uniform, half smiling, unaware of the years waiting ahead. In time, the war ended. The flags changed, the cities changed, the river stayed the same. The wreck of the bridge sank slowly into the mud, swallowed by silt and tide. Fishermen sometimes spoke of finding old metal beneath their nets, rusted fragments, bits of track, pieces of something once immense. The current carried everything away, but never the memory. Decades later, old soldiers still met in quiet corners of coffee shops, their hair white, their hands trembling as they lifted their cups. When the talk turned to the war, to the cities lost, the comrades gone, someone would always mention the bridge. Someone would say the name softly, almost reverently, as though speaking it aloud might disturb the dead. Nguyen Ngoc Nhuan. They would fall silent then, each man lost in his own recollection of smoke and thunder, of the roar of a single machine gun defying the impossible. In every war there are battles that history remembers, great victories, grand defeats, the turning points marked on maps. But there are others that exist only in the hearts of those who survive them. The stand at Cua Viet was one of these, a moment of courage swallowed by the larger tide of loss. Yet within that moment, something enduring lived on, the measure of one man's will against the collapse of an entire world. The river flows quietly now, its banks reclaimed by grass and silence. The bridge is gone. The war is gone. But when the wind moves just right across the water, those who listen closely might still hear it. The faint echo of a machine gun, the heartbeat of a forgotten soldier who refused to let the tide pass. And in that echo lives his legacy. One man's courage holding the line between chaos and survival, between memory and oblivion, between a nation retreating and the honour that would not. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment below. I always read what you think. Hit like if you learned something new, and subscribe so you don't miss the next untold story of war, courage and survival. Turn on the bell for more history brought to life. See you in the next one.